guys, and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 9. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at V-Ray's environment fog system, and although it may render slowly, it's an extremely easy way to add dimension and atmosphere to your scenes. And if you're patient enough, it also allows you to create some awesome effects like clouds, steam, and floating dust. Because it reacts incredibly well to dome lighting, realism is very easily achieved. However, with that being said, the physical shape of the environment fog is quite hard to control, and you won't be able to finely tune it, especially if you don't have a lot of time for R&D. Although I'm still discovering new ways to get the most out of the system, in this lesson I'm going to show you how to set up a few example scenes that utilize it to its full extent. I should also note that all these effects can be achieved with Phoenix FD, which is superior for this type of work, but for those of us who just want a quick, simple solution, it's really great stuff to know. Now, like I was saying, because of the long render times, you do have to rely heavily upon trial and error when working with fog. So in this lesson, I'm also going to clarify what render settings work best for the fog and what to look out for when optimizing your scenes. So let's get started with the basics, and we'll just set up a simple fog solution, and then we can take a look at the important settings that affect our render time and quality. Then after that, we'll get on to creating those various scenes. To get started, I've built a scene which is going to very quickly show off some of the important features of environment fog, while at the same time keeping it simple enough to gain an understanding of what the settings are doing. So to give you a quick run through of kind of what the scene has in it, let me just close these. I've got a few things disabled at the moment, but we'll turn those on as we start to run through the different settings. But you can see I've got a V-Ray Sun, which, because I don't use exposure control on the V-Ray camera, I've turned the intensity down. However, if you're using a V-Ray camera, feel free to keep that intensity up. But for this particular scene, I do have a V-Ray Sun in there. We've also got an HDR dome turned off, which is going to also kind of simulate what the sun is doing, just to compare render times. And then lastly, we've just got a small point light behind the camera, which is just going to illuminate the tunnel in kind of one direction, so we get a better idea of how dense the fog is. Lastly, I've got a few reflective cones in here, and you can see the walls are colored. That's going to be for later on when we're trying to show off the GI being enabled and disabled in the fog volume. But also, once again, these cones are just to show you that the fog is reflected as well as refracted if you need it to be. So by default, I've got the environment fog turned off, and that's because I wanted to make sure that the scene itself was being correctly sampled. So if you remember going all the way back to our first lesson and kind of the third lesson where we were jumping into scene optimization, some of those old workflows that I was talking about will apply here still, but with just a little bit of modification. Because we're introducing a new render element, we need to factor in how that affects the render time as well as the render quality. But I've done quite a lot of extensive testing over the last couple of weeks, kind of preparing to build this lesson, and what I've found is as usual, try and keep your subdivs where they're meant to be. So what I mean by that again is that when we introduce the environment fog, and to do that, just go up into the renderings menu and then environment, or by default it's set to 8. And you'll see in the atmosphere tab, not in the common parameters, we've got the environment fog option, and you can enable that or disable that here. So by default we've got that disabled. All the settings are in here, and I'll run through that in a second. But for now, I just want to render off this scene so you've got an idea of where we're at. And I should also note that going through the settings here, I've disabled the anti-aliasing. And I've done that by raising the color threshold so high where it's only going to use that minimum subdivs amount. So each pixel will have one subdiv applied and no more. So if I render that, you'll see the scene renders quite quickly, but there's no anti-aliasing. However, with that being said, just because there's no anti-aliasing on the edges doesn't mean I don't have the correct scene samples set up. So if I run through here, you can see we've got the global illumination, and without any AA, that's rendering quite smoothly. You've got the lighting, once again, that's rendering quite smoothly, and we are being lit by that light behind the camera. The reflection is a little bit noisier, but I've found that's quite hard to clean up. So we'll just let the AA solve that last little bit. And you can see in our sample rate, we've got nothing going on. So there's no AA happening at all. So now, if I go into the environment tab slot, and just bring that up, and I enable the environment fog, you can see here I've got no gizmos enabled, so it's not using any kind of different algorithm to solve it. It's all going to be rendering quite quickly. I've got the fog distance set to 4,000. This value here is basically telling you at what point the fog becomes 100% dense. So this tunnel is 2 meters long, and I know it's just a small scale scene, but it's just designed for a starting point. But if I set that to 2,000 centimeters, because the camera's 2 meters away from the edge of that plane, it would be exactly 100% dense at the end of this corridor. But because we don't want it to be so dense, I've just doubled that and I've got it at 4,000, and we'll just start rendering it. Before I do that though, I just want to bring the subdivs down to their default. And also I want to point out that as in the first lesson, we're using our render elements to determine how noisy things are, we need to do the same for the environment fog. And to do that, we need to enable the V-Ray atmosphere render element. So that's what's going to show you where your noise is coming from in the environment fog itself. Just if you're a little bit lost as to where that might be. So I've enabled that, and we'll just render it again. And now you can see the fog's rendering, and it's quite dense. And at first, when I was starting to use this, I was a little bit confused because there's not much information in the documentation about how it's being sampled and what's being affected. But as I did a little bit more research, I kind of found out that it was a little bit inaccurate doing testing on scenes where I didn't have a lot of stuff visible, like GI and reflections and textures. And the reason for that is because when you go to sample the fog, it's kind of adding a whole cloud of noise over your scene. And you can see here that once again we've got no anti-aliasing happening. So we know the AA isn't actually controlling the smoothness of the fog. And at a subdiv value of 8, there's just not enough to clean it up. So like my usual workflow, I always try and disable AA, get the scene samples to the point where I don't see any noise except like what we were seeing earlier on the edges, and then I start to kind of increase the AA just enough to clean up those edges. So now if I go to 32 on the scatter bounces, on the subdivs, that control, the subdivs value, is going to control how noisy our fog is. So if I do another render, you'll see it starts to become a bit smoother. And there you go. So the biggest problem I think most people are going to do when they introduce environment fog into their scene is not have enough subdivs in it, or be scared of that subdivs value because it is increasing the render time quite a bit. However, with that being said, it's always a better option to increase those values than to just resort to AA. The tricky part is when you start getting a blend between the detail in the scene, like on the edges and stuff like that you're seeing here, and the fog, and knowing what value to put for the AA so that you kind of can clean up your scene, say if you had textures on the floor for example, while at the same time not oversampling the fog, because you are introducing more AA to clean up your textures. So it's finding that balance, which can become a little bit tricky, but it is quite simple. You just need to make sure you've got the subdiv values set high enough so that when we go introduce AA, which is what I'm about to do, the AA isn't sampling all the noise from the fog, because the fog will be covering everything. So now that I've raised the subdivs up on the fog to be high enough where there's still a bit of noise, but hopefully not enough to affect our anti-aliasing, and we can see we've got a render time of 1 minute and 5 seconds here, and I'm just going to save that off. Just bring up the history menu here. Now I'm going to go in, and you can see I've got a min and max of 1 and 8, which was enough to clean up this scene as it was without the fog, And now I'm just going to drop the color threshold down to 0.025 as a kind of mid starting point. In my scenes in production, I'll usually go between 0.01 and 0.04, depending on how much noise I need removed. But ultimately, I'll kind of start with 0.025 just to get an idea of things. So now we want to make sure that we're not anti-aliasing the fog. So let's go to the sample rate, and you can see because we've got the fog subdiv set high enough, it's not introducing all this work for the anti-aliasing engine, which is what's supposed to be happening, and it will give you the most fastest results. You can see now also we've got our edges sampled, kind of how we want them. Maybe we could go a little bit lower on that threshold just so that we're seeing red on those edges. But at the end of the day, we're not making more work sampling the environment fog. You can see we've kind of got a very finely balanced scene here, and if I go any lower, all these little speckles and things like that won't be from the environment fog. It'll most likely be from things like the reflection, as you can see here. So we can either increase those reflection subdivs, or we can just let the AA solve it. But because they're so few and far between in the sample rate pass, we don't need to go up higher on the reflection. Because you have to remember also, just because we're looking at the individual render element doesn't mean that's what you're looking at in the beauty pass. And all those render elements might add up to a point where you don't notice that noise. So the render's finished now, and you can see the time over doubled, which might not be ideal, but when you start to introduce AA, it's going to slow the render down quite a bit. But now I want to show you the difference between if I lower all the subdivs on the environment fog and let the AA solve that, and we'll see the time difference in rendering. First though, let me just compare these two. So you can see the before and after, but the fog itself isn't changing at all because we're not targeting that area, which when I was doing all my original testing is exactly what was happening. The sample rate pass was kind of blowing out yellow on the environment fog, and I was sitting there going, why are the render times taking so long? But it was just because I wasn't using enough subdivs. So you can see all we've done when we've introduced the AA is once again just targeted the areas we want. We've got the floors being sampled, we've got the lights being sampled around the highlights, so now they're clean. And that's about it. That's all we want it to do, but the render time went up quite a bit. So let's compare the two. I'm just going to get rid of the first one, which doesn't have AA. And now I'm going to change the subdivs back down to 8 and drop the color threshold to 0.01 so that we're using more AA to clean up that noise because we've lost subdivs in the environment fog. So this is kind of what was happening when I first started out testing environment fog. My sample rate pass changed completely because it's now having to do all the work on the fog itself. And the render times went quite haywire. So you can see here it's already predicting the render time is going to be 10 minutes. And that's just because the fog system itself is universally covering the entire scene. That means every single pixel is having to be sampled by the AA engine. And I know I'm probably repeating myself here, but it's just, I need to solidify that so you know to use the correct subdivs amount. So I'm just going to cancel this now because we've got too much AA happening. You can see it's doing it on the walls and everything like that, and it's not ideal. So I'm going to swap back to the settings we had before and just run you through a couple of the settings in the scene before we go in and add textures and things like that. Actually, I'll just make that 0.03. And we're going to go to 32 again on the subdivs. So when you're not using textures to control the environment fog, there's only a couple of settings here which will have an effect. One of those is the fog height, and you can see here, even though I've got a gizmo for loading later, at the moment we don't have any gizmos loaded, and these walls are 2 meters high, so that's how high the fog's going. If I drop the fog height to 50 centimeters, it'll be somewhere between these two, it will be exactly between those 2 points. So I'll do another render and just show you how that affects it. And there you can see, even though the camera's lower and we're kind of looking into the fog height itself is way lower, so we're getting more visible fade off at the top. So there you go, it's just a little bit lower. Now if I drop it down to be 10 centimeters high, so it's below the camera line, you'll just kind of see it looks like a bit of mist on the floor. But at the same time, you need to also increase the density of the fog so that you can see it. So I'll just let this render anyway, and then I'll show you how you have to, as you kind of lower the height, because it's fading off, you need to increase the density. So now if I just go into the atmosphere tab, you can see it's visible there, but it's quite thin. So now if I drop the fog distance from 4,000 centimeters to 1,000, it's just going to increase the thickness of that. And all this is pretty basic. We'll get into creating some of the effects in just a second. I just kind of need to run through these settings. So as you can see, as we decrease the fog distance, the thickness of the fog increases. Alright, so now let's take a look at what the Effect GI button is doing, or the Scatter GI. In order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to go in and make a couple of modifications to the scene. I'm going to disable the light that we previously had behind the camera, and I'm just going to enable the dome light. I'm going to turn off the environment fog and just show you what the scene looks like without any fog, and then we'll go in and render the fog with and without the GI button enabled. So I'm just going to save that. Next up, we're just going to bring the fog height back to 200 centimeters so that it is high enough that we are catching fog through the cracks where the sun's coming through up the top here, through these kind of ridges in the left. And I'm going to disable the Scatter GI. On top of that, we're going to go back to our starting point of 4,000 centimeters, and I'll just do another render. Sorry, I just didn't have it activated. I've just got it activated now. So now that it's rendered, you can see it doesn't exactly look correct. The scene kind of looks much darker than it used to. And because we've got all this fog being scattered throughout the scene and no light is bouncing off of it, we're only seeing direct light, it's kind of darkening off the rest of the GI. It's kind of acting like a mask on the light that's meant to be traveling through this scene, because in reality, those dust particles still scatter light the exact same way as any other molecule does. It's just that in V-Ray we've decided to disable that feature, and it's just made everything darker. So now I'm just going to enable it and we'll just compare the two. So it looks a lot more natural now. And when I save these two and compare them, you'll just be able to see that. So now V-Ray isn't actually meant to be used without the scatter GI option and without fog emission. Because adding the GI slowed the render down so much, even though it is physical and I personally use it all the time, to get around that lack of light in the scene, you can kind of fake it with the fog emission. And that's just going to fake light from those particles being emitted. So if you've got a kind of overall blue sky, you can just include a little bit of a light or a very dark blue tinted color to make up for that information that we're not getting in the GI. Because you're not going to get the exact color right away, it's sometimes good just to go in and do a region render of a kind of foggy area and then start introducing that color and compare it to the surrounding area. I'm just going to start out with kind of trying to match a similar color, and maybe I can go in and sample this just to get a rough idea. I'm just going to drop back the saturation a little and darken it off, and we'll see what that looks like. So now we've got scatter GI turned off and the fog emission turned on, which kind of fakes the effect of GI in the scene. So now the tone of our scene is still very similar in terms of brightness, but the color's not going to be as detailed because now we've just got one single color going through, and the color from the walls and the floor and everything else isn't affecting that fog, so it's not going to pick up those tints. But it's much quicker to render, so it's up to you guys to decide. If you're rendering an outdoor scene with a bit of trees, it'd probably be better not to use scatter GI. So there's just one last setting, and that's the fog color. It's pretty self-explanatory. All it's going to do is change the diffuse value of the particles that make up the fog. So if you were in a more dusty landscape, you'd probably tint the fog color a little bit more yellowy and brown, because then you're actually scattering dust and larger scale particles. If you're scattering stuff like mist and fog, you'd take away the color because that's just water in the air, small tiny molecules of water and not actual dust and sand particles. So I'm just going to introduce a bit of color. I've turned on the dome light just so we're lighting it with that natural lighting again, and we'll see how it looks when we tint that. Sorry, you can see once again I just didn't have it activated. And now when we introduce that color, you can see the effect that has. I'll just pause it. So as this render's finishing up, if I go to the atmosphere element, you can see now that the sun rays are actually coming through the fog to produce that kind of God ray-like effect. And even though we've got very light mist and light dust scattering in the scene, and it's not that obvious, if you create more contrast in your lighting so that this area here is darker, say in the shadow areas, and you make your light stronger, you'll enhance that effect. So the next thing I want to show you is how to produce those type of God rays you'd see. So this scene will be included with the lesson. However, just to save a little bit of time on some of the boring setup, I've just jumped to having the scene set up, and I'll just explain what's going on. So it's the same scene as before with just a couple of modifications. I've taken away all the random stuff, and now we're left with just a floor plane, a box that's going to contain the fog, and a roof which has a Burcon map set at the opacity. So you can see here that it's just leaving some holes where the clouds would be. On top of that, I've got this box here set to be the environment fog's gizmo. So in the environment fog, you've got the option to contain the fog to any primitive you want. It doesn't have to be an atmospheric apparatus. So if I go in here into helpers and atmosphere, you'll see there's a box gizmo. At first I thought that's all I could use, but in reality you can use whatever you want, just as long as you set the object to be non-renderable. So you can see here it's just a normal box primitive, and if you just right click it and make it not renderable. That way it won't have any effect on the scene other than to contain the fog itself. So we're still quite simple at this point. There's just the light, the floor, and the fog inside. And I'll show you what that looks like, just so that you know that the shadows from the fog are also affected, and you do end up with the God rays. So just as that render's finishing up, you can see now how the fog's behaving quite realistically. However, as the lesson's about to get a little bit more advanced and we're going to introduce textures to control the density, one issue that myself and others on the forum encountered was that you can't have two separate fog volumes. So how do you end up with fully CGI clouds, yet with the same kind of distance haze you'd see near the ground level causing the rays themselves? So let me just bring up an image to show you what I'm talking about. So because there's fog in the entire atmosphere, not just in the clouds, we've got a more dense fog creating the clouds up the top here, and then it's much more sparse down the bottom, yet the light still shines through. So in this example, all we've got is the God rays themselves, and you'd have to composite in the clouds. So now I want to take things a little bit further and introduce to you how to start to control the fog using textures and Burke-on maps and gradients and things like that. So moving on, we're once again working with a scene which was derived from the first scene, and I've just taken a few things out and I've just decreased the size of the gizmo we're using. So you can see in this scene we've got box 04 as the gizmo, which is 1 meter by 1 meter in all directions. Sorry, 2 meters by 2 meters in all directions. Now what we want to do is we want to start to gain control over the density of the fog with a gradient ramp texture. And there's a couple of little things to set up when you do that. So just load the gradient ramp up and drag this to the material slot. Or what I like to do is I like to go to the slate editor for things like this. And I'm just going to shrink this in size for you. And I'm just going to drag it in here. So you can see at each point in the gradient, now we've got a texture that we can actually map to it. But before we do that, we just want to make sure that the gradient is correctly gamma adjusted so that when we do see the fog, it's not overly bright. So I'm just going to put a color correction over the top of it. And now if we go down to advanced and you see in the gamma contrast, we can adjust that to be the inverse and just set it to 0.454. And that's just a starting point. You're going to have to probably go lower with this. So now in this gradient texture, we also need to set it to planar from object so that the gradient is correct. Before I do render it though, I just need to drag the color correction slot to the fog density so that it's correctly mapped. Now you can see as the preview showing and as it's rendering, we've got a